History has witnessed a year that is remembered by this very name. During that year, people across the globe were shocked and terrified, wondering where the summer season had disappeared. Farmers were left heartbroken as their flourishing crops were destroyed almost overnight. Rivers, springs, and lakes froze solid even during the warmest months of the year. An eerie darkness covered the skies even in broad daylight. People looked up at the heavens in fear, confused by the rapidly falling temperatures. But the true cause of these strange and terrifying clouds wasn't in the sky at all. The real reason for this global catastrophe lay thousands of miles away on Earth, a single event that disrupted the entire world's climate. In Indonesia lies the beautiful and lush island of Sumbawa. On this island stood a silent giant known as Mount Tambora. The mountain was so tall that its upper half was often hidden behind clouds, rising to approximately 4,300 meters. It was the highest peak in the region at that time. For centuries, the volcano had remained completely silent, like a sleeping giant. Around it were thriving settlements where people lived peaceful lives. They cultivated their fields, caught fish from the sea, and enjoyed prosperity. But they had no idea that beneath this magnificent and silent mountain, a terrifying disaster was slowly taking shape. Deep underground, a vast ocean of molten magma was steadily building pressure, powerful enough to shake the entire Pacific region. Then came April 10, 1815, the historic and terrifying day when Mount Tambora finally unleashed centuries of built-up fury. This was no ordinary volcanic eruption. According to experts, it was the most powerful volcanic explosion in the last 10,000 years of human history. The explosion was so enormous that its sound was heard thousands of miles away, as far as nearly 2,600 kilometers from Sumbawa. On distant islands and coastlines, people believed a massive war had broken out nearby. British military officers even ordered their cannons to be prepared. Convinced that enemy warships or pirates were attacking, the sky turned pitch black in the middle of the day. Then, instead of rain, the heavens began pouring burning rocks, volcanic ash and fire, a deadly river of scorching gas, ash and rock known in science as a pyroclastic flow raced down the mountain at speeds of hundreds of kilometers per hour, with temperatures exceeding 10 degrees Celsius. This inferno was so powerful that it wiped out the entire kingdom of Tambora and the surrounding villages within moments. No one had even a single second to run, think, or save themselves. The massive explosion and the collapse of the volcano also generated gigantic tsunamis that swept across nearby coastlines, drowning countless settlements. When the smoke finally began to clear several days later, the survivors looked back in disbelief. The mountain summit, which had once towered thousands of feet into the sky, had completely disappeared. In its place remained nothing but a massive caldera, gigantic crater nearly 6 kilometers wide and 1 kilometer deep. When most people think of a volcanic eruption, they imagine rivers of lava causing the greatest destruction. But in the case of Mount Tambora, lava was not the real killer. The lava remained mostly around the mountain itself. The true devastation came from the enormous cloud of gases that was blasted high into the atmosphere. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the eruption released an astonishing amount of smoke, fine volcanic ash, and millions of tons of sulfur dioxide gas into the sky. The plume rose all the way into the stratosphere, the upper layer of Earth's atmosphere. The sulfur dioxide and tiny aerosol particles didn't simply disappear. Powerful high-altitude winds carried them across the globe, eventually spreading them over much of the northern hemisphere. The stratosphere lies roughly 10 to 50 kilometers above Earth's surface. Because there is very little atmospheric turbulence there, anything that reaches this layer can remain suspended for a long time. These microscopic particles formed a thick, invisible veil around the planet One that reflected and blocked a significant portion of the sun's light and heat from reaching the Earth's surface. And when sunlight can no longer warm the ground properly, the planet begins to cool. It was a silent, invisible enemy, an enemy no one could see, yet one that slowly took control of Earth's climate and forced millions of people to endure an unbearable cold. The terrifying consequences of this atmospheric blanket became fully apparent the following year, 1816. History still remembers it as the year without a summer. The months of June, July, and August, which were normally filled with sunshine and heat, became frighteningly cold. Across New England, Canada, and many northern parts of the United States, heavy snow fell in the middle of July. Temperatures dropped so suddenly and so severely that even during the height of summer, many places experienced freezing conditions below 0 degrees Celsius. The crops that should have been growing never had a chance. People were forced to light fires inside their homes in the middle of July just to stay warm. Everywhere, people asked the same heartbreaking question: what sin have we committed to deserve this? Farmers watched helplessly as every seed they planted was buried beneath unexpected snowfall. Birds, unable to find food and survive the bitter cold, began falling from the sky. The situation in Europe was no different. Dense fog, gloomy skies, and relentless cold refused to leave. As food supplies dwindled, hunger spread rapidly. Disease soon followed, claiming countless lives. The strange and unimaginable weather plunged the entire world into fear, confusion, and psychological despair. As crops failed to grow because of the extreme climate, severe food shortages spread across many countries. One of the oldest principles of economics tells us that when supply disappears while demand continues to rise, prices soar. That is exactly what happened. The prices of wheat, rice, and other basic food supplies became far too expensive for ordinary people to afford. This marked the beginning of endless waves of looting and violence. Riots broke out across cities, towns, and villages throughout Europe and North America. People stormed grain warehouses, stole food from one another, and fought desperately just to survive. Daily life became a nightmare for millions of ordinary people, all because of a volcano that had erupted thousands of miles away in Indonesia. What is even more astonishing is that during 1816, while the world was suffering through this disaster, nobody actually knew its true cause. Today, if even a small earthquake strikes or the weather changes suddenly, we receive instant notifications on our phones through the internet. But back then, there was no internet, no television, no telegraph, and no fast means of communication. People in Europe and America could clearly see that something was terribly wrong. Snow was falling in the middle of July, and temperatures were unusually cold. However, they had no idea that the true cause was the massive eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. This lack of information gave rise to countless rumors and theories. Some believed that Judgment Day had arrived. Others thought the sun had permanently lost its power. Many religious people saw it as divine punishment for humanity's sins, because no one knew the truth. These frightening explanations only increased people's panic. Many even went to bed each night wondering whether there would be another sunrise. At this point, you might be wondering, how can a volcano that erupts with fire and lava actually make the entire Earth colder? The science behind it is somewhat complex, but here's the simplest explanation. When Mount Tambora erupted with unimaginable force, it blasted tens of millions of tons of sulfur dioxide gas high into the upper atmosphere, known as the stratosphere. There, the gas reacted with tiny droplets of water and formed sulfate aerosols. These aerosols were no ordinary particles. They acted like billions of microscopic mirrors floating high above the Earth. Together, they formed an invisible blanket around the planet. Whenever sunlight reached Earth, a large portion of it was reflected back into space before it could warm the surface. With less solar energy reaching the ground, Earth's average temperature dropped dramatically. Imagine as if someone switched on the world's air conditioner at full power, but then lost the remote control. So, how did this eventually come to an end? The sulfur particles and volcanic ash could not remain in the stratosphere forever. Gradually, gravity pulled them back down to Earth. By 1817, people began noticing slight improvements in the weather. However, the destruction had been so severe that recovery took time. By 1818 and 1819, sunshine slowly returned across much of the world. Summers became warmer again. Crops began growing once more, and green fields gradually replaced the barren landscapes. Scientists believe that by around 1820 roughly, 5 years after the eruption, the Earth's climate had finally returned to normal. Although this catastrophe happened more than 200 years ago, an important question remains: would modern civilization be safe if something similar happened today? Unfortunately, the answer is probably no. In fact, the consequences could be even worse. If another super eruption filled the atmosphere with volcanic ash, the first major casualty would likely be the global aviation industry. Volcanic ash is extremely dangerous for jet engines. The world witnessed this danger when British Airways Flight 009 accidentally flew into a volcanic ash cloud near Jakarta. All four of its engines failed. Fortunately, the pilots managed to restart the engines and land safely. But the incident proved just how deadly volcanic ash can be for modern aircraft. Now imagine if flights across the entire world were grounded instead of just one region. Millions of travelers would be stranded wherever they happened to be. Global trade would slow dramatically, supply chains would collapse, and international transportation would be severely disrupted. Financial markets would likely crash as panic spread. Millions of people could lose their jobs at the very moment when food supplies became scarce and prices skyrocketed. Fear would keep people inside their homes. And in today's digital world, social media could spread misinformation and panic faster than ever before. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, humanity still remains vulnerable before the overwhelming power of nature. In the face of a catastrophe like Mount Tambora, we would be far less prepared than we like to believe, and perhaps not much safer than the people who lived through the year without summer in 1816. And this is the incredible story of the year without summer.